The Grand Conclave of Ethon Prime was the most powerful room in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of a space station so large that it had its own weather system inside. The walls were made from crystallized starlight, harvested from dying suns. The seats were carved from the bones of ancient ships that had sailed the void before most civilizations even knew fire. The room could hold 2,000 beings from across 47 different species, and today every single seat was filled. The occasion was important enough to bring them all together. Earth had applied for membership in the Galactic Council for the third time in 60 years. Ambassador Lyra Vasquez of Earth sat in the observation gallery above the main floor. She was not allowed on the floor itself. That was only for full members. She sat in the glass box, reserved for guests and outsiders and petitioners. She wore a simple dark uniform with the small blue and white patch of Earth stitched on her shoulder. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Her eyes watched everything. Below her, the representatives of 47 civilizations moved and buzzed and floated and crawled into their seats. The Volkai arrived in their black insectoid armor, their 6 arms folded tight against their bodies, their compound eyes catching light like broken mirrors. The Thavine drifted inside their pressurized environmental spheres, moving slow as clouds, their ancient bodies barely visible inside the swirling gas. The Maroon delegates walked in a tight cluster of 12, all sharing one collective mind, all moving with the exact same rhythm, like a single creature wearing 12 bodies. Council Speaker Draelvas took his position at the center podium. He was ethony tall and pale, with 4 long fingers on each hand and eyes that were completely silver. He tapped his staff against the floor twice, and the room fell silent with the kind of speed that only happens when everyone already knows who is in charge. He spoke in Galactic Standard, which every translator and plan in the room rendered perfectly into each species' native language. The Council recognizes the third application of the planet Earth, System Sol, Outer Spiral Arm, for full membership in the Galactic Council of Civilizations. He said, "The floor is open for assessment." The first to rise was High Representative Kess of the Volkai. She unfolded herself to her full height, which was nearly 3 meters, and placed a data crystal on the submission podium. The crystal projected a holographic report into the air above the floor, visible to everyone in the room, including Lyra in the gallery. The Volkai Biological and Threat Assessment Division has completed its 3rd review of the human species. Kess said. Her voice came out as a series of clicks that the translator rendered into flat, even tones. Our findings remain unchanged, and in fact have grown more concerning with each passing review. Humans are the only known sapient species in recorded galactic history to have nearly caused their own extinction, not once, but twice through their own deliberate actions. They fought wars using weapons capable of destroying their entire atmosphere. They poisoned their water, they burned their forests, they collapsed entire ecosystems for economic profit, and then held international conferences to argue about whether the collapse was real. There was a low ripple of sound across the chamber, something between laughter and horror, depending on the species making it. Kess continued, "In the 60 years since their first application, humans have not fundamentally changed. They have simply moved their conflicts into space. They have had 14 significant armed conflicts between their own nation-states. Since their first application, they have 3 separate active military presences beyond their home system, none of which were approved by this council. They are biologically driven by competition, aggression, and what their own psychologists describe as an almost compulsive need. Dominate their environment." She stepped back. The Volkai vote no. The next speaker was Elder Vaughn of the Thavine. The ancient gas dweller drifted forward inside its sphere, its voice coming out as a deep, low hum that the translator turned into slow, careful words. "The Thavine have observed humanity for 140 of their years." Vaughn said, "We have watched them with great interest and with great concern. In that time, we have seen remarkable things. They built a civilization from nothing. They reached the stars without help. They survived diseases, wars, resource collapses, political revolutions, and no fewer than 3 near-extinction events caused entirely by their own choices. And yet they are here, they survived all of it, but survival is not the same as wisdom. A creature that survives by burning everything around it is still dangerous even if it means no deliberate harm. The Thavine vote no. One by one, the representatives rose. The Maroon Collective stated that human individualism was fundamentally incompatible with galactic cooperative governance. The Pelari said that human emotional volatility made them unpredictable and therefore untrustworthy in high-stakes diplomatic situations. The Sauron reminded the chamber that a human vessel had accidentally triggered a gravitational anomaly in the Delvar system 2 years ago by running an unsanctioned FTL test near populated moon. The pilot had apparently done it on a dare. Each speaker sat down, and the no votes stacked up like stones. Lyra watched all of it from her glass box above. She did not shift in her seat. She did not check her communicator. She did not whisper to the aide sitting beside her. She simply watched with the same calm, steady expression she had worn since she sat down. When the final vote was cast, Speaker Draelvas read the count aloud. 41 votes against admission, 8 votes in favor, 2 abstentions. Earth's application for membership in the Galactic Council is denied. The chamber began to move again as delegates rose to leave their conversations, already turning to other business. Earth was not the only item on the agenda today. It was not even the most important one to most of them. It was a routine denial of a routine application from a species everyone had already agreed was not ready. Draelvas was gathering his documents when something made him look up. It was the human ambassador. She had stood from her seat in the gallery, and she was straightening her jacket with 2 careful movements. Her aide was already moving toward the exit, but Lyra herself was not moving, yet she was looking down at the chamber floor, and Draelvas found his silver eyes drawn to her face, because something about her expression did not match the moment. She was smiling. Not the brittle, polite smile of someone hiding embarrassment, not the tight, controlled smile of a diplomat keeping their composure. It was something quieter than that, and something far harder to read. It was the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had just watched events unfold exactly the way they expected. Draelvas watched her for a moment longer than he intended to. Then she turned and walked out of the gallery without a word, without a gesture, without a single look back at the chamber that had just rejected her world for the 3rd time. The speaker stood at his podium for a moment after she was gone. He told himself he was simply reviewing his next agenda item. He told himself the expression on her face meant nothing. He told himself that the human ambassador was simply a professional, keeping her composure in a difficult moment. He was very good at telling himself things. But the smile stayed with him longer than he expected, and when he finally moved on to the next order of business, he found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. He found himself wondering what the other person in a conversation was actually thinking. He did not yet know that wondering that question about a human being was the first step toward understanding just how badly the council had miscalculated. And he did not yet know that the miscalculation had already begun to grow into something the galaxy had never seen before. The intelligence report arrived on Speaker Draelvas's desk 6 months after the vote. It was flagged routine, which meant it came from an automated monitoring system, and not from a live analyst. Routine reports were reviewed by junior staff first, and only passed up the chain if something unusual was found. Most routine reports never made it past the 3rd floor of the Council Intelligence Division. This one made it all the way to the speaker's private office in 4 hours. The analyst who sent it had written only 1 line of personal note at the top of the file before forwarding it. "Sir, I think you should see this yourself." Draelvas sat down and opened the file. The report was a 6-month activity summary of human deep space operations, standard tracking data, pulled from beacon signatures, jump trail residue, and the passive sensor networks the Council maintained throughout explored space. The data was supposed to show the slow and unremarkable activity of a species that had been denied interstellar community membership and was presumably licking its wounds. Instead, it showed something that made the speaker read the document 3 times before he accepted that he was reading it correctly. Human deep space activity had not slowed after the rejection. It had increased by over 300%. 31 new jump-capable vessels had been registered in human space in the 6 months. Since the vote, 14 of those were a class of ship that Council analysts had not seen before: long-range high-capacity vessels with extended life support systems and cargo holds large enough to transport not just goods, but entire communities of people. The humans were not retreating. They were moving outward. And the direction they were moving was not random. They were establishing new outpost colonies in a ring pattern along the outer boundary of Council-controlled space. But every single one of those outposts sat just outside Council jurisdiction, by a margin so precise that it could only have been deliberate. The humans had studied galactic boundary law carefully enough to know exactly where the Council's authority ended, and they were building right on that line, like a contractor who knows exactly where the property then sits before pouring a foundation. Drael Voss called a closed session with the Intelligence Division's senior staff. The following morning, he did not tell them why he wanted to see if they had noticed what he noticed. They had not. But when he showed them the data, the room went very quiet very fast. "They're not applying anymore," said Senior Analyst Torin, a young Ethoni with sharp eyes and the habit of speaking before she had fully organized her thoughts. "They're not waiting for us, they're just going around us." "Show me the diplomatic logs," Drael Voss said. "All human outreach activity for the past 18 months. The logs took 2 hours to compile, because nobody had been watching them closely. The Galactic Council's diplomatic monitoring system tracked interactions between Council members and other Council members. It tracked interactions between Council members and applicant civilizations. It did not robustly track what applicant civilizations were doing with the dozens of smaller species that the Council had never formally inducted and largely ignored. When the compiled logs appeared on the briefing room display, the room went even quieter. In the 18 months before the vote, Earth had made formal diplomatic contact with 19 non-Council civilizations. 17 of those contacts had progressed to signed bilateral agreements covering trade, mutual defense, information sharing, and infrastructure development. 17 separate species who had never been offered a seat at the Council table, who had spent generations being diplomatically invisible, had received offers from humanity and had said yes. The Council had spent decades studying humanity's capacity for conflict and aggression. It had never once commissioned a study on humanity's capacity for making friends. "How did we miss this?" said Division Chief Marek, a Volkai veteran, who had been in intelligence work for 40 years. His tone was not angry. It was the flat, stunned tone of someone trying to understand how a calculation they trusted had produced a completely wrong answer. "Because we were watching for weapons," Torin said quietly. "We were watching their shipyards, their military exercises, their border skirmishes. We were watching for signs of danger. We were looking for teeth. We were not watching for handshakes." Drael Voss stood and walked to the display. He looked at the network of connections spreading out from the small blue dot of Earth across the map like roots from a tree. Each line was a relationship. Each relationship was a promise. Each promise was a brick in something that had no name yet, but was already clearly a structure. "Pull the communication archive," he said. "I want every outgoing transmission from Ambassador Vasquez's office from the day of the vote forward." Most of the transmissions were administrative reports filed with Earth's government, scheduling confirmations, meeting notes. But near the bottom of the stack from the morning after the vote, there was a single message sent to all 17 partner civilizations. It was brief. The message said that the Council had voted no again. It said that Earth respected the Council's decision. It said that Earth had no interest in forcing itself into a room that did not want it there. It said that Earth was grateful for the partnerships it had already built, and that those partnerships would continue and grow regardless of what any large governing body decided. And then at the very end of the message, in the same plain, practical tone as everything before it, the message said one more thing. It said that Earth had always believed the galaxy was big enough for more than one kind of table, and that it intended to keep building. Dreylvas read that line 4 times. He was not a dramatic being. He had spent 60 years in galactic politics, and he had trained himself to receive information calmly and process it rationally. But something about that single sentence from a human diplomat, written the morning after her world's third rejection, hit him in a way he had not expected. Because it was not a threat. It was not angry, it was not bitter, it was not the language of a wounded civilization vowing revenge. It was something far more unsettling than any of those things. It was a simple statement of intention from a people who had already decided what they were going to do, and were simply informing others of the fact. He set the file down and looked at his senior staff. I want full-spectrum monitoring on all human activity effective immediately. He said, every jump trail, every transmission, every diplomatic contact, I want reports on my desk every 72 hours, and I want them flagged priority, not routine. Sir, said Marek slowly, if we increase monitoring to that level, and the humans detect it, they may interpret it as hostile surveillance that could damage any chance of future negotiations. Dreylvas looked at the map again, at the quiet spreading network of lines, connecting Earth to 17 other civilizations, while the Council had been busy congratulating itself on keeping the dangerous species out. They already know we're watching them, he said. They have always known we were watching them. They built all of this while we were watching, and we still missed it. He picked up his documents and moved toward the door. Start the monitoring. I will draft a full briefing for the security circle by end of day. He stepped out into the corridor, and the door closed behind him. For a long moment he stood still. He was thinking about a smile. He was thinking about a human woman standing in a glass gallery above a chamber that had just told her world no for the third time, and smiling like someone watching a plan arrive exactly on schedule. He had told himself that smile meant nothing. He was beginning to understand that the smile had meant everything. The Wraith Dominion did not ask permission for anything it never had in 400 years of recorded contact with the wider galaxy. The Wraith had sent exactly two kinds of messages to other civilizations: demands and notifications. The demands came before they took something, the notifications came after. The only difference between the two was timing. When 40 Wraith warships entered the Kelvar corridor, without announcement, without treaty approval, and without any communication at all, the three small civilizations living in the systems along that corridor did not panic because they had been expecting something like this for years. They panicked because they had spent those years asking the Galactic Council for a mutual defense agreement, and the Council had spent those same years tabling the request, recommending further study, and forming a subcommittee. The subcommittee had met 11 times, and produced a report that was currently sitting in a document queue waiting to be formally received. When the distress signal from the Kelvar corridor reached Ethon Prime, the Council convened an emergency session within 4 hours that was considered fast by Council standards. Speaker Dreylvas opened the floor for response proposals. The Volkai military representative outlined 3 possible options and their associated risks. The Thavine elder requested that any military consideration be preceded by a full diplomatic review. The Marun collective stated that the situation required consensus before action could be ethically justified. 17 speakers rose in sequence to discuss the severity of the crisis, the importance of proportional response, the need for clear legal authority before any fleet movement, and the potential long-term diplomatic consequences of acting too quickly. The discussion lasted 9 hours. At the end of 9 hours, the Council had agreed in principle that something should be done, and had approved the formation of a rapid response working group to determine what that something should be. The working group was scheduled to meet in 48 hours. The humans had already moved. The Council learned about it not from a human communication, but from a Reth transmission. The Reth flagship in the Kelvar corridor sent a terse 3-line message to Reth Command. It was intercepted by a Council listening post. It said that an unknown fleet had dropped out of FTL between the Reth Armada and the target systems. It said the fleet was human and coalition. It said that a transmission had been received from the human command vessel, and that the Reth were withdrawing pending review of the transmission content. 11 hours after the distress signal had reached Ethon Prime, the crisis was over. The working group met anyway, because it had already been scheduled. Nobody in the room spoke for a long time when the update was given. The Thavine Elder's pressurized sphere drifted gently in the air conditioning. Current, the Volkai representative, sat completely still, which for a 6-limbed insectoid was the equivalent of staring with an open mouth. The working group filed a report noting that the situation had been resolved by non-council actors and recommending a formal inquiry into how human and coalition vessels had arrived in the Kelvar corridor so quickly. Drael Voss sent an immediate request for a meeting with the human coalition's senior military representative. The meeting was granted within hours, which itself was remarkable, because the Council had spent 60 years making humanity wait for every single meeting, every single document review, every single procedural acknowledgement. The speed of the response felt pointed, though the human side was too professional to say so. The meeting took place via secure holographic link. The human on the screen was Admiral Sun Akefer. He was a broad-shouldered, dark-skinned man with close-cut gray hair, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have been in enough dangerous situations that nothing surprises them anymore. He wore a plain uniform with no decorative rank markings beyond a small flag of Earth on his chest. He looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that he did not need anything on his clothes to tell people who he was. Drael Voss thanked him for responding quickly. He then asked, without diplomatic softening, exactly what had been said in the transmission sent to the Reth flagship. Admiral Akefer looked at him with calm, flat eyes. "We reminded them of what happened to the last empire that ignored a human warning," he said. Drael Voss waited for more. No more came. "That is the entire content of the message," the speaker said. "The relevant part," Akefer said. "And what did happen to the last empire that ignored a human warning?" The Admiral's expression did not change. "I'd recommend pulling your historical archives on the Coven Reach conflict, the Draven boundary war, and the Sethari expansion attempt. Your analysts will find the answer there." Drael Voss pulled those archives the same night. He assigned 4 senior historians to the task and told them to report back within 24 hours. They reported back in 9, because what they found was not buried or obscure. It was simply data that nobody in the Council had ever thought to compile into a single document before, because nobody had ever thought the information was related. The Coven Reach conflict had begun when a mid-tier expansionist civilization called the Coven pushed into human-adjacent territory and destroyed 2 human research stations. The humans had warned them twice. The Coven had not taken the warnings seriously. The conflict that followed lasted 11 months. And at the end of it, the Coven Reach civilization existed only in historical records. The Draven boundary war had started when the Draven ignored 4 increasingly direct human diplomatic messages about contested mining rights. The war had lasted 6 months. The Draven still existed, but had lost 60% of their fleet and had not attempted military expansion in 112 years. The Sethari expansion attempt had ended before it became a war entirely, because the Sethari had apparently learned from watching the previous 2 cases and had chosen to negotiate. When the first human warning arrived, they were one of the 17 civilizations now in the human coalition. The historians presented their findings in a single document, with a summary line at the top that Drael Voss read standing at his desk at 3 in the morning station time. The summary said, "In every recorded instance of direct military conflict initiated against human interests, the human side has achieved strategic victory. The average duration of such conflicts is 8.3 months. The average outcome for the initiating party is significant and permanent reduction in military and political capacity. No civilization that has engaged in direct sustained military conflict with humanity has subsequently attempted to do so again." Drael Voss set the document down. He walked to his window and looked out at the stars, which from the station looked like salt scattered on black cloth. He thought about the Council's risk assessment of humanity, the one that said humans were volatile, unpredictable, dangerous. He thought about how the assessment had been built entirely around the question of whether humans might start something. Nobody had ever built an assessment around what happened when they finished it. He thought about 40 Wraith warships turning around in 11 hours after a single transmission from a human admiral, who had not even thought it worth his time to quote the message in full. He thought about the smile on Ambassador Vasquez's face in the gallery above the chamber 6 months ago. And then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He picked up a direct comm channel and called the intelligence division in the middle of the night. "I want a complete profile," he said when Torin answered, still half asleep. "Not a threat assessment, a complete profile, every conflict, every alliance, every warning given, and what happened afterward, every promise made, and whether it was kept every time a human diplomat was dismissed, and what they did next." There was a pause on the line. "Sir," Torin said carefully, "that profile is going to be very long." "I know," Drael Voss said. "I suspect that is part of the point." He closed the channel and stood alone in his office in the dark. Outside the Kelvar corridor was quiet. The 3 small civilizations there were safe tonight, not because the Council had acted, but because a coalition that did not yet have a name had moved faster than anyone expected, and had said something to the most feared military power on that border that had made 40 warships turn around without a shot being fired. The Council had spent 60 years studying what humans might do if they were allowed inside. Nobody had thought to study what they would build if they were kept outside. That mistake was becoming very expensive very fast. The second emergency session of the Galactic Council in 3 months was called without a public agenda. It was listed in the official scheduling system only as a closed security review, which was the Council's way of saying something had gone wrong, and they did not want anyone outside the chamber to know how wrong it was. All 47 member representatives were required to attend in person, no proxy votes, no remote holographic links. The Council chamber was swept for listening devices 3 times before the session opened that alone told the delegates everything they needed to know about the mood of the Speaker's office. Drael Voss stood at the center podium, and he did not go through the usual ceremonial opening. He did not tap his staff. He did not recite the traditional greeting of the convened body. He looked at the assembled representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy, and he simply began. "The human coalition now counts 31 member civilizations," he said. The room was already quiet. It got quieter. "We held our last vote on Earth's membership application 7 months ago. The human network of bilateral relationships included 17 civilizations in the 7 months. Since that vote, they have added 14 more. Every new member is a species. This council has categorized at some point as peripheral, non-strategic, or insufficiently developed for formal induction." He paused and looked around the room. "In other words, every new member of the human coalition is a species we ignored. And the humans did not." High Representative Kess of the Volkai straightened in her seat, her compound eyes catching the chamber light. "The question before us is whether this constitutes a security threat. The human coalition has not attacked any council member. It has not issued any hostile declarations. It has not violated any galactic law. The Kelvar intervention was technically legal, under the mutual defense provisions of their bilateral agreements. The humans cannot be censured for acting within the law. The question is not whether they broke the law, said the Maroon collective representative, all 12 bodies speaking in unsettling unison. The question is what they are building and whether we understand it. That landed in the room and stayed there. Because the honest answer that everyone in the chamber knew but nobody had yet said aloud was no, they did not understand it. They had the data, they had the monitoring reports, they had the intelligence files that Drail Voss had ordered compiled. After the Reth incident, those files were now the longest active dossier in the Council Intelligence Division's history. And they were still growing. But having data was not the same as understanding. And what was happening in the space beyond the Council's borders was something that none of their analytical frameworks had been built to process. The Thavian elder spoke next, and it spoke slowly the way it always did. But today the slowness felt less like the rhythm of an ancient species, and more like someone choosing each word with great care. We have been discussing the human species for 60 years, in terms of what they might do to us if we let them in. The elder said, I would like to propose that we have been asking the wrong question entirely, and that this is why we find ourselves here tonight surprised and uncertain, when we have had 6 decades of observation to work with. The pressurized sphere drifted slightly as the elder continued. The right question was never what will humans do if we accept them. The right question was what will humans do if we do not, and we never asked it, because we assumed the answer was nothing. We assumed they would wait. We assumed they would keep applying. We assumed that our table was the only table that mattered, and that any species with sense would simply keep trying to reach it. The chamber was very still. We were wrong, the elder said simply. They did not keep waiting. They went and built their own table, and they were very quiet about it, and very patient, and now their table has 31 seats and growing, and we are sitting here in an emergency session trying to understand how it happened. The representative from the Pelari civilization, a species of tall, blue-skinned beings known for their precise mathematical thinking, raised their hand and spoke in the clipped, careful tone of someone reporting a calculation result. The current trajectory of coalition growth, if maintained, will see the human network exceed council membership numbers within 14 months. At the current rate of new diplomatic contacts and partnership agreements, the human coalition will represent more total populated systems than this council within 2 years. The Pelari representative set down their data tablet. I want to be clear that this is not a projection based on assumptions. It is a mathematical extrapolation of recorded activity. The humans have not changed their pace. They have been consistent since the day after the vote. The growth rate now is the same as it was 6 months ago. They have not accelerated because they have not needed to. That produced the kind of silence that has weight to it. Division Chief Marak of the Volkai intelligence community spoke up from the gallery level, where the senior staff observers sat. We have also completed the conflict history profile. The speaker requested, after the Kelvar incident, the findings are significant. He transferred the document summary to the main display. In reviewing 140 years of human external relations, we found that in every instance where humans issued a formal diplomatic warning that was subsequently ignored, the outcome was decisive and unfavorable for the party that ignored the warning. In every instance where humans offered partnership that was accepted, the partnership held. In every instance where humans made a promise in a diplomatic agreement, the promise was honored. We found no recorded exceptions to any of these patterns across 140 years and interactions with over 60 civilizations. Cass turned her head slowly toward the display. None. None, Marak confirmed. Their record of keeping agreements is statistically the most consistent of any spacefaring civilization in our database, more consistent than council members, more consistent than the Thavian who have been in diplomatic practice for 3,000 years. Another long silence. It was the representative of a small council member called the Versh, who had spoken only twice in full chamber session in 20 years, who said the thing that broke the silence open. We have to offer them membership again. The room reacted the way rooms react when someone says something obvious that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say first. There was movement and sound, and the particular social discomfort of a group of beings who have just had their position clearly stated back to them. Drael Voss raised a hand, and the room settled. A proposal has been drafted by the Speaker's office in consultation with the Security Circle. He said Earth would be offered full membership in the Galactic Council, with a permanent seat on the Security Circle and full voting rights effective immediately upon acceptance. He looked around the room. The offer would be communicated to Ambassador Vasquez directly through a priority diplomatic channel. The Council's position would be that we recognize the changed landscape of galactic relations and wish to build a stronger future together. The Thavine elder spoke again. And what do we do if she says no? The room went completely silent for the third time that evening. It was a question. None of the proposals and counter-proposals and security reviews had actually addressed, because it was a question that had never needed to be asked before the Council offered membership the applicant accepted, or was denied. That was the direction. The power in that transaction had always flowed. The idea that the answer might come back as something other than grateful acceptance had simply not been part of anyone's thinking. Drael Voss said, "We proceed with the offer, and we respond to whatever answer we receive with appropriate flexibility." That was diplomatic language, for we do not know, and we are hopping. We do not have to find out. The motion passed 43-4. The priority diplomatic channel was opened that same evening. A message was transmitted to Ambassador Lyra Vasquez's official office on the Human Outpost Station, just outside Council space, informing her that the Galactic Council wished to offer Earth full membership and requesting her earliest convenience for a formal discussion. The response came back in 40 minutes. Not from Vasquez directly, but from her office assistant, a polite professional message that said Ambassador Vasquez had received the Council's communication with appreciation and would be happy to discuss the offer. But the message also said that she would need to consult with her coalition partners before making any decisions, and that she expected to have a preliminary response for the Council in approximately 3 weeks. Drael Voss read the response standing at his desk in the same spot where he had stood reading intelligence reports for months now. He read it twice. Then he sat down very slowly in his chair. Because that message had just told the Galactic Council something it had never been told before in its 300-year history. It had told the Council that the decision about whether to join was not Earth's alone to make. It had told the Council that there were 31 other civilizations whose opinions Ambassador Vasquez considered relevant to her answer. It had told the Council that the question of membership was no longer a conversation between one applicant and one body. It had told the Council that humanity had already built something that had its own weight, its own voice, and its own process, and that the Council was now on the outside of that process, waiting for a response. The Speaker sat alone in his office and thought about 60 years of votes and reports and assessments and subcommittees and risk evaluations. And he thought about what it felt like to be the one waiting for an answer for a change. Ambassador Lyra Vasquez arrived at Ethon Prime not as a petitioner this time. She arrived as a co-host. The summit had been her idea, or rather it had been the natural result of the response her office had sent 3 weeks after the Council's membership offer. The preliminary response had been longer than anyone expected, and its contents had been circulated among the security circle with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for military threat assessments, because, in a quiet way, that is exactly what it was. The response acknowledged the Council's generous offer. It expressed genuine appreciation for the changed position. It noted that Earth and its partners had discussed the matter thoroughly. It then said that Earth would be pleased to accept membership under a revised framework, and it laid out what that revised framework looked like in precise and courteous detail. It was not a counteroffer in the traditional sense, A counteroffer implies that one party holds the position of power, and the other is negotiating for a better deal. This was something different. This was a set of conditions written by a coalition of 31 civilizations who had looked at the current structure of galactic governance and identified everything that was wrong with it, and then written down what a better version would look like. They had been apparently thinking about it for a while. The document was extremely thorough. The Galactic Council could choose to accept the framework and welcome humanity and the coalition into an expanded and restructured governing body, or it could decline and allow the existing division of galactic civilization to become permanent. The document did not say this in threatening language. It said it the way an engineer describes structural options: one path, the other path. Here are the load-bearing differences. The Security Circle had debated for 4 days before recommending to the full council that they accept and negotiate details. The full council had voted 39 in favor, 6 against, 2 abstaining. Now Vasquez sat across a real table from Speaker Drael Voss and 12 other senior delegates in the negotiation chamber of Ethon Prime, and for the first time in 60 years of Earth's relationship with the council, she was sitting on the floor and not in the gallery above it. The room felt different at floor level. She had always known it would. The negotiations took 11 days of working through the details of what the new framework would actually look like in practice, how the old council structure would be reformed, how the new member civilizations would be integrated, how voting representation would be recalculated to reflect actual population and system counts rather than the historical tier system that had conveniently always placed the founding members at the top. The Human Coalition's legal team had clearly spent considerable time on the mathematics of fair representation, because every time a council delegate suggested a formula that would dilute the coalition's collective voice, the human team had a counter-formula ready within minutes that was both more mathematically defensible and more difficult to argue against without sounding openly self-interested. By the 7th day, several council delegates had started arriving early to the sessions. By the 10th day, the Thavine Elder had privately told its aide that the human negotiating team was the most prepared group of diplomats it had encountered in its 3,000-year diplomatic career, and that it meant that as the highest possible form of praise. On the 11th day, the framework was signed. It was called the Galactic Accord. Vasquez had suggested the name in the final session, and nobody had objected, because it was a good name. It said what it was. It did not try to make itself sound more important than it was. The Accord restructured the Council into an expanded body with proportional representation, established a new joint security framework that formalized coalition arrangements like the one that had resolved the Kelvar incident, and created a permanent seat on the new governance circle for every civilization above a minimum population threshold, which happened to include all 31 members of the Human Coalition and 19 additional species who had previously been classified as peripheral and non-strategic. The signing ceremony was public and formal and very well attended. Vasquez signed for Earth with the same calm expression she had worn in the gallery above the chamber 11 months ago. She did not make a long speech. She said that she was grateful to the Council for its willingness to build something better, and that she looked forward to the work ahead. And then she sat down, and the next delegate signed, and the ceremony continued. Afterward, there was a reception in the Great Hall of the station, where delegates from 78 civilizations stood together for the first time in the same room as formal equals. The food tables were an extraordinary collection of items prepared for dozens of different biologies and dietary requirements. The catering had been organized by the Human Delegation Support Team, and it was excellent. Drael Voss found himself standing near one of the large viewports, looking out at the stars, holding a drink. He was not really tasting when he heard footsteps beside him, and knew, without looking, who it was. Vasquez stood next to him, and also looked out at the stars for a moment without speaking. "I want to ask you something," Drael Voss said, And I want you to know I am asking as an individual, and not as the speaker of this body, because, as the speaker, I suspect I am not supposed to admit that I do not know the answer." She glanced at him with the faint trace of a smile, asked, "Was any of this planned?" He said, "From the beginning, from the first vote from 60 years ago, was there a strategy, or did it develop as it went?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stars the way people look at things when they are deciding how honest to be. "The first rejection, we were just hurt." She said, "We genuinely believed we were ready, and we genuinely believed that being ready was enough. We did not understand. Yet that being ready and being wanted were two different things. The second rejection, we were angry. We spent years after that arguing internally about what we were doing wrong, and whether we should change ourselves to fit what the council wanted. And that argument went nowhere good." She paused. "By the third application, we had stopped arguing. We had been watching for 60 years, and we had started noticing something. We noticed that the species the council rejected or ignored or forgot were not actually weak or unready or dangerous. They were just not useful to the founding members, so they had been set aside. And those species had things to offer. Each of them had something, and nobody was offering them anything in return for it." Dreylvas said nothing. "So we started talking to them," Vasquez said. "Not because we had a grand strategy, not because we had decided to build a rival power to the council. We talked to them because they were there, and because nobody else was talking to them, and because humans are not very good at seeing someone who needs a conversation and walking past them." She smiled more fully now. "The structure came later, the coalition came later, the accord came much later. In the beginning, we were just making friends." He looked at her for a long moment. "And the patience," he said. 60 years of waiting, 3 rejections. You maintained your direction for 60 years without breaking from it, without retaliating, without escalating. That is not something that happens by accident. That requires something I am not sure I have a word for." "We have a word for it," she said. "We have several, actually." She looked back at the stars. "But the simple one is this: we did not wait because we were patient. We waited because we were busy. And when you are busy enough doing the right things, time moves differently." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Around them, the reception continued. Representatives of civilizations that had spent years ignoring each other were having actual conversations. Some of them were laughing, the sound of different kinds of laughter in different registers and tones and pitches mixing together in the great hall of Ethon Prime was not something that had ever been heard in that room before. It was an unusual sound. It was a good sound. Dreylvas finally said, "The council made a significant error in judgment." "Yes," Vasquez agreed without any particular emphasis. She did not say it to wound him. She said it the way you agree with a statement that is simply true. "We studied the wrong things," he said. "We studied your capacity for destruction. We should have studied your capacity for connection." She did not argue with that. "What would you have found if you had studied it correctly?" she asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything. "I think we would have found that the most dangerous thing about your species is not that you fight," he said. "I think we would have found that the most dangerous thing about you is that when you are rejected, you do not collapse, and you do not attack. You get to work, and you do not stop." Vasquez looked at him, and her expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter than that, something that looked like recognition. "That is probably the most accurate thing anyone outside our species has ever said about us," she told him. He nodded once. "I will ensure it is included in the updated profile," he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that happens when something strikes a person as genuinely funny. Rather than politely amusing, it was a warm sound, and it echoed slightly in the viewport alcove, and a few nearby delegates glanced over and then went back to their own conversations. The galaxy outside the window was the same as it had always been, vast and cold, and full of light from suns so far away that the light arriving at this window right now had left its source before Earth had learned to write. But the room behind them was different than it had been yesterday. And tomorrow it would be different again. That was the thing about humans that the Galactic Council had spent 60 years failing to understand, and was only now beginning to learn. They did not just survive what came at them. They changed what came next. And they had been doing it so long and so consistently, and so quietly, that by the time anyone noticed, the world had already shifted beneath their feet, and the humans were standing exactly where they had planned to be all along, not because they had forced their way there, but because they had simply refused for 60 years to stand anywhere else. The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched for miles in every direction, and inside it gathered the representatives of 4,000 species from across 3 galaxies, all of them united under one government that had ruled the stars for over 50,000 years. And today they had come together for one purpose only: to decide the fate of a small blue planet called Earth and the strange creatures who lived upon it. High Arbiter Vexillan stood at the center podium, his tall gray body wrapped in ceremonial robes that marked him as the supreme leader of the Theshan Dominion and the current voice of the entire council. And he looked out at the assembled delegates with his 4 eyes burning with righteous anger. For today was the day they would finally deal with the human problem once and for all. "Fellow citizens of the Galactic Order," he began, his voice carrying across the vast space through thousands of translator devices. "For 300 years, we have watched the species called humanity spread across the stars like a disease, and for 300 years we have extended to them the hand of friendship and civilization, and for 300 years they have ignored us completely." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber, and delegates from 100 different worlds nodded their heads or tentacles or whatever body parts they used to show agreement, because everyone knew the human problem had gone on far too long. The Vordani Admiral, a massive reptilian creature covered in blue scales, rose from his seat and slammed his fist against his desk. "They have colonized 47 worlds in protected space without filing a single territorial claim form, and when we sent inspectors to their colonies, they simply pretended we were not there. My people sent 17 ambassadors to Earth," added the representative from the Kellish Collective, a being made entirely of living crystal that chimed when it spoke, and each one was redirected to something called the Department of Motor Vehicles, where they waited in line for 6 months before giving up and returning home in despair. The chamber erupted in outrage at this tale of bureaucratic cruelty, and High Arbiter Vexillan had to bang his ceremonial staff against the floor many times before order was restored. And when silence finally fell, he spoke again with cold determination in his voice. "The humans believe they are above our laws, and they believe they can simply ignore the greatest civilization the universe has ever known. But today we will show them how wrong they are. For today, I propose that we declare total war upon the human species and bring them to their knees." The vote was unanimous, all 4,000 species agreeing that humanity must be taught a lesson they would never forget. And within hours, the declaration of war was drafted and signed and broadcast across every frequency in the known universe, a message that reached every corner of every galaxy, and announced to all creation that the Galactic Council had spoken, and humanity would submit or be destroyed. On the bridge of the Council's flagship, Admiral Kethrin of the Vordani fleet watched the transmission go out and felt pride swelling in his chest. For he had been chosen to lead the Grand Armada against Earth, 12 million warships carrying the combined military might of 1,000 worlds, enough firepower to crack planets and extinguish stars, and soon he would have the honor of accepting humanity's surrender. "How long until we receive their response?" he asked his communications officer, a small furry creature with enormous ears designed to pick up the faintest signals across vast distances of space. "Any moment now, Admiral," the officer replied. "Surely they must have received our transmission by now. The entire galaxy is watching and waiting to see what the humans will do." They waited for 1 hour, then 2, then 5, and still no response came from Earth or any of the human colonies scattered across their small corner of the galaxy. And Admiral Kethrin began to pace back and forth across his bridge with growing frustration. "Perhaps their communication systems are too primitive to receive our message," suggested his tactical officer, though he did not sound convinced. "Or perhaps," the Admiral growled, "they are too arrogant to respond. Perhaps they think they can simply ignore us as they have ignored everything else, but they will learn soon enough that the Galactic Council is not so easily dismissed." Meanwhile on Earth, the declaration of war had indeed been received, interrupting a popular cooking competition show right at the moment when the judges were about to announce which contestant had made the best pasta dish. And across the planet billions of humans groaned in annoyance and changed the channel to find something more interesting to watch. In the city of New York, a man named Dave was sitting in his apartment eating breakfast when his phone buzzed with a news alert about the alien declaration of war, and he glanced at it briefly before shrugging and going back to his cereal, because he had a meeting at work in an hour, and that seemed much more important than some aliens throwing a tantrum on the other side of the galaxy. At the United Nations headquarters, a tired secretary watched the alien transmission 3 times before sighing and forwarding it to her supervisor with a note that read, "Another one of these, please advise." Because this was actually the 17th declaration of war the Earth had received from various alien species over the past century, and none of them had ever amounted to anything serious. The official response from humanity came 6 hours later, not because it took that long to compose, but because the person responsible for drafting such responses had been on their lunch break, and then had to attend a birthday party for a coworker named Susan who was turning 50. And the message simply read, "We acknowledge receipt of your declaration. Please note our offices are closed for the holiday weekend. Someone will get back to you." When this response reached the Galactic Council, High Arbiter Vexalan read it 17 times, certain that he must be misunderstanding something, certain that this must be some form of sophisticated psychological warfare designed to unsettle the Council before the real negotiations began. But no matter how many times he read the message, it still said the same thing. "They cannot be serious," he whispered to his advisors. "No species in the history of the galaxy has ever responded to a declaration of war by saying they are too busy with a holiday weekend." "Perhaps it is a trap," suggested one advisor. "Perhaps they want us to let our guard down before they strike with some devastating weapon we have never seen before." "Or perhaps," said another advisor with obvious contempt, "the humans are simply as stupid and primitive as we have always believed, too foolish to understand the danger they are in." High Arbiter Vexalan did not sleep that night, or the night after, or the night after that, lying awake in his quarters and staring at the ceiling while his mind raced with possibilities and fears, because something about the human response troubled him deeply in ways he could not quite explain. Any species facing extinction should be terrified, should be begging for mercy or preparing desperate defenses, or at least acknowledging that they were in danger. But the humans had done none of these things, and their casual dismissal of the most powerful military force in the universe suggested either complete ignorance or complete confidence, and Vexalan was not sure which possibility frightened him more. In the depths of space, the Grand Armada began its long journey toward the Sol system, 12 million ships carrying warriors from 1,000 worlds, all of them eager to teach humanity a lesson about respecting the Galactic Council, all of them certain that this war would be quick and easy and glorious. None of them had any idea what was waiting for them. The Grand Armada of the Galactic Council arrived at the edge of the Sol system after 3 weeks of travel through hyperspace, and Admiral Kethrin stood on the bridge of his flagship and gazed upon the human homeworld for the first time. A small blue and green sphere hanging in the darkness that seemed far too fragile and insignificant to have caused so much trouble. 12 million ships, he said with satisfaction. the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the galaxy, enough firepower to destroy this entire system 100 times over. And yet the humans have not even attempted to flee or surrender. Truly, they must be the most foolish species we have ever encountered. His tactical officer was studying the sensor readings with a puzzled expression on his scaled face. "Admiral, I am detecting very little military activity in the system. There are some patrol vessels near the outer planets, and what appears to be a small defense station orbiting Mars, but nothing that could possibly threaten our forces." "As expected," the Admiral replied with a confident smile. "They probably have nothing more than primitive rockets and chemical weapons. This conquest will be over before the day is finished. Open a channel to their leadership and inform them that they have one final chance to surrender." The transmission was sent across all frequencies, Admiral Kethrin's face appearing on every screen and device in the Sol system as he delivered humanity's ultimatum in his most commanding voice. "People of Earth, you have been found guilty of crimes against the Galactic Council, and your sentence is total subjugation. Surrender now and your lives will be spared. Resist and you will be destroyed. You have 1 hour to comply." The response came not from Earth's leaders, but from a bored-sounding traffic controller at a Martian cargo station. A young woman named Jessica, who was halfway through her shift and really just wanted to finish her coffee before dealing with any more problems. "Yeah, we see you on sensors," she said with a yawn. "You are blocking shipping lane 7, which is used for cargo transport between Mars and the asteroid belt. Could you move about 2 degrees starboard so the freighters can get through? Thanks." Admiral Kethrin stared at his viewscreen in disbelief, his jaw hanging open and his eyes wide with shock, because he had just delivered an ultimatum that should have brought any civilization to its knees, and this human female was asking him to move his fleet so she could direct cargo ships. "Do you understand what I am saying?" he roared. "I command 12 million warships. I could destroy your entire species with a single order, and you are concerned about shipping lanes." "Listen, buddy," Jessica replied while taking a sip of her coffee. "I do not make the rules, okay? If you want to file a complaint, you can contact the Mars Transport Authority, but they are closed until Monday, so you will have to wait. In the meantime, please clear the shipping lane or I will have to report you for obstruction." The Admiral ended the transmission and stood in stunned silence for several long moments, while his bridge crew exchanged nervous glances. And then his shock transformed into rage, and he slammed his fist against the arm of his command chair hard enough to crack the metal. "Target the Mars colonies," he bellowed. "If they will not take us seriously, then we will teach them to fear the might of the Galactic Council. Begin orbital bombardment immediately, and do not stop until every human structure on that planet is reduced to ashes." The fleet moved into position and opened fire, thousands of ships unleashing streams of plasma and energy weapons that turned the sky above Mars into a blazing inferno of destruction. And Admiral Kethrin watched with grim satisfaction as the bombardment continued for 6 straight hours, enough firepower to level mountains and boil oceans. When the assault finally ended and the smoke began to clear, the Admiral ordered his sensors to scan for survivors, expecting to find nothing but ruins and devastation, and what he found instead made his blood run cold. "Admiral," his tactical officer said in a trembling voice, "the colony is still there. Their defense grid absorbed 94% of our bombardment. The remaining 6% caused minor damage to a water treatment facility and what appears to be a recreational center of some kind." "Impossible," the Admiral whispered. "We hit them with enough firepower to crack a planet. How could they possibly have survived?" The answer came in the form of a transmission from the Mars colony, showing the face of an annoyed-looking human man in a maintenance uniform. "Hey, so that light show you just put on damaged our water recycling plant and also knocked out the pool at the community center. My kids were supposed to have swimming lessons tomorrow, so thanks a lot for that. Anyway, someone will be sending you a bill for the repairs." Admiral Kethrin did not respond because he could not think of anything to say, his mind struggling to process what was happening, because this was not how wars were supposed to go. The enemy was supposed to be afraid. The enemy was supposed to beg for mercy. The enemy was not supposed to send you repair bills. Back on Earth, the news of the Martian bombardment was reported on the evening broadcasts between stories about a celebrity wedding and a sports tournament, and most humans who heard about it simply shook their heads and muttered about those annoying aliens before going back to their normal lives. But in certain secret facilities hidden beneath mountains and oceans, and in the depths of space, people who had been waiting a very long time for this moment began to make phone calls and send encrypted messages, and projects that had been dormant for decades were suddenly reactivated. General Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force put down her phone and smiled a smile that would have terrified anyone who saw it, because she had spent her entire career preparing for this day, hoping it would never come, but knowing that someday it would. And now that it was finally here, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt excited. "Get me Admiral Morrison and General Park," she said to her aide, "and tell them to dust off the contingency plans, all of them. It seems our guests have decided to make themselves a nuisance, and I think it is time we showed them why that was a very bad idea." Across the solar system, humanity began to stir like a sleeping giant slowly opening its eyes, not with urgency or panic, but with the calm, deliberate movements of a predator that knows it has all the time in the world, because the aliens had made a critical mistake in their calculations. They had assumed that humanity's small visible military was all they had, a reasonable assumption for most species who kept their defenses in plain sight. But humanity was not most species. Humanity had spent its entire history fighting itself in wars of incredible violence and destruction, and they had learned long ago to keep their real weapons hidden until they were needed. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, a submarine that officially did not exist received orders that its captain had been waiting 30 years to hear, and as he read the message, his weathered face broke into a grin that made his crew step back in fear. "Finally," he whispered to himself, "finally we get to show these bastards what we are really made of." The Galactic Council had declared war on humanity, expecting a quick and easy victory, expecting the humans to surrender or die within days, expecting this to be nothing more than a minor police action against a primitive species. They had no idea that they had just woken something ancient and terrible, something that had been pretending to be harmless, something that was now very, very interested in teaching them why that was the worst mistake they had ever made. The real war was about to begin. 3 months had passed since the Galactic Council declared war on humanity, and in the great chamber where that declaration had been made with such confidence and pride, there was now only confusion and fear, because nothing about this war was going the way it was supposed to go. High Arbiter Vexelan sat in his private quarters reading the latest reports from the front lines, and with each page he turned his hands trembled more and more, because the numbers made no sense, the stories made no sense, nothing about the humans made any sense at all. The Council had sent 12 million ships to conquer Earth, and in 3 months they had captured exactly 0 human territories, not a single colony, not a single outpost, not even a single asteroid mining station, and the casualty reports were so horrifying that Vexelan had ordered them classified at the highest level. Entire fleets were disappearing without sending distress signals. One moment they would be there on the sensors, and the next moment they would simply be gone, as if they had never existed at all, and the few ships that managed to escape these encounters brought back stories that sounded more like nightmares than military reports. "The humans do not fight like any species we have ever encountered," Admiral Kethrin reported in a transmission that showed his face haggard, and his eyes haunted by things he had witnessed. "They do not form battle lines. They do not declare their intentions. They do not follow any of the rules of civilized warfare. Instead, they simply appear inside our formations without warning and destroy everything around them before vanishing again. How is that possible? Vexalan demanded. No ship can move through space without being detected. Our sensors can track a vessel from light years away. Their ships are different, the Admiral replied with a shudder. They use some kind of stealth technology that makes them invisible to our sensors, and their weapons are unlike anything in our databases. They use projectiles, Admiral, simple metal slugs accelerated to incredible speeds, and these slugs pass through our energy shields like they are not even there. The High Arbiter leaned back in his chair and tried to process this information, because energy shields were the foundation of galactic military technology. Every species used them, every species depended on them, and the idea that the humans had found a way to simply ignore them was terrifying beyond measure. But the reports from space were not the worst of it, because the ground invasions had gone even more horribly wrong, with entire battalions of Council soldiers surrendering to human rescue teams and begging to be taken prisoner rather than face another night in human territory. They hunt us, one captured Vordani soldier said in his debriefing, his scales pale and his eyes constantly darting to the shadows as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. We landed on one of their colony worlds expecting to face farmers and workers, but instead we found ourselves being stalked through the forests by things that moved without sound and killed without mercy. Were they soldiers? The interrogator asked. I do not know what they were, the soldier replied. They did not wear uniforms, they did not fight in formations. They simply appeared out of nowhere and dragged our people into the darkness. And the sounds they made when they killed, I will hear those sounds in my nightmares for the rest of my life. The Council's intelligence officers worked day and night to understand what they were facing, gathering every piece of information they could find about human history and culture and military doctrine, and what they discovered made them wish they had never started this war. Humans were not a young species fumbling their way into space like the Council had assumed. They were survivors of a death world, a planet so hostile and dangerous that most species would never have evolved intelligence there at all. A world of extreme temperatures and violent weather and predators that killed for pleasure. And the humans had not just survived on this world, they had conquered it. They had risen to the top of the food chain by being more violent and more adaptable and more persistent than anything else on their planet. And they had spent their entire history fighting wars against each other with weapons of increasing devastation. According to our analysis, the chief intelligence officer reported to the Council, the humans have fought over 40,000 wars among themselves in the past 10,000 years. They have developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet many times over, and they have survived multiple extinction-level events through sheer determination and refusal to die. But their military is so small, protested a delegate from the Kellish Collective. We counted their ships and soldiers, and they have barely enough to defend their own system. That is their public military, the intelligence officer replied grimly. The forces they allow other species to see. But our analysts have discovered references to something they call black budget projects, secret military programs funded through hidden channels that do not appear in any official records. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in, because if the humans had been hiding their true military strength, then everything the Council thought they knew about this war was wrong. There is more, the intelligence officer continued. We have also discovered references to private military corporations, mercenary fleets owned by wealthy humans who maintain their own armies and navies outside of government control, and something called state militias, which appear to be regional military forces that operate independently of the central command. How many soldiers do they actually have? High Arbiter Vexalan asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. We cannot determine exact numbers, the officer admitted. But conservative estimates suggest that the forces we have been fighting represent less than 5% of humanity's total military capability. And there are also references to something called Florida Man, which our analysts have been unable to classify, but which appears to be some kind of elite chaos unit. Vexalan buried his face in his hands and wondered how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Because 3 months ago he had been certain that this war would be over in days, certain that the humans would surrender or be destroyed, certain that the mighty Galactic Council could crush any resistance. And now here he was, watching his coalition crumble as species after species demanded to know why they were losing to a planet that most of the galaxy had never even heard of. The final blow came later that day when he received a transmission from Earth. Not a surrender or a peace offer, but something far worse. A recorded video of a human child's birthday party, showing laughing children eating cake and playing games, while in the background, a television newscast mentioned the Galactic War as a brief footnote between the weather report and sports scores. The humans were not fighting for survival, Vexalan realized with growing horror. They were not desperate or afraid or even particularly concerned about the war that was supposed to destroy them. They were treating the greatest military force in the history of the galaxy as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And that could only mean one thing. The forces that had been hunting the Council's fleets and terrorizing their ground troops, the invisible ships and unstoppable soldiers and nightmare weapons, those were not humanity's elite warriors or their secret military or their hidden superweapons. Those were their amateurs. High Arbiter Vexalan looked at the smiling faces of the human children on his screen and felt something he had never felt before in his long and distinguished career. He felt absolutely terrified. 6 months into the war, humanity finally decided that the Galactic Council had become a genuine nuisance, and when humans decide something is a nuisance, they deal with it in ways that would make other species weep with terror. The counterattack did not begin with fleets or armies or weapons of mass destruction. It began with something far more devastating. It began with economics. For 200 years, ever since humanity had first made contact with the wider galaxy, human corporations had been quietly expanding into alien markets, buying small shares in companies here, establishing subsidiary businesses there, offering loans and investments and trade deals that seemed generous and harmless at the time. Nobody had paid much attention because humans were supposed to be a minor species, a primitive civilization barely worth noticing, and surely their little business ventures could not amount to anything significant. But while the galaxy was busy ignoring them, humans had been playing a very long game, weaving themselves into the fabric of galactic commerce so thoroughly that by the time anyone noticed it was already far too late. On a Monday morning that would become known as Black Monday throughout the galaxy, human megacorporations executed a coordinated financial strike that had been planned for decades, calling in every debt, selling every share, and withdrawing every investment simultaneously. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Thessian Dominion, the most powerful species in the Council and the home of High Arbiter Vexalan himself, watched their currency become worthless in less than 3 hours as human investors dumped trillions of credits worth of Thessian bonds onto the market. The Vordani fleet, which had been so eager to conquer Earth, suddenly found itself unable to afford fuel for its ships, because the corporation that supplied their energy crystals was 40% owned by a human company that had just frozen all their accounts. 47 council species faced immediate economic collapse as the financial systems they had built over thousands of years came crashing down around them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it, because the humans had made themselves too important to remove without destroying everything else in the process. "This is impossible," screamed the Thessian finance minister as he watched his economy disintegrate. "How could they have done this? We never saw them as a threat. We never even noticed what they were doing. That was the point, replied his human counterpart in a video call. A smiling woman in a business suit who seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. You were so busy looking down on us that you never thought to look at what we were building right under your noses. And now, you owe us more money than your entire civilization can repay in 1,000 years. 3 council species surrendered to humanity before the end of the week, not because they had been conquered in battle, but because their governments had gone bankrupt and their people were rioting in the streets demanding peace. But for the species that refused to surrender, for the proud warriors who swore they would fight to the last soldier rather than submit to a bunch of primitive apes, humanity had something else prepared. The real military was finally ready to move. They did not send fleets or armadas or anything so conventional. Instead, they sent single ships, massive dreadnoughts that appeared in orbit above enemy worlds without warning, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust and render it uninhabitable for millions of years. The first to receive a visit was the Vordani homeworld, and the ship that arrived was the UNS Consequence, a vessel so large that it blotted out the sun when it positioned itself in orbit, and the message it broadcast was very simple. Your fleet attacked our colonies, the human commander said in a calm voice that somehow made her words more terrifying. Your soldiers killed our people, and now you have a choice. Surrender unconditionally within the next 6 hours, or we will demonstrate why that was the worst decision your species has ever made. The Vordani leadership debated for 5 hours and 59 minutes before finally agreeing to surrender. And as they signed the documents that ended their participation in the war, they asked the human commander why she had given them so long to decide. Because we wanted you to understand, she replied with a cold smile. We wanted you to spend 6 hours staring at our ship and imagining what would happen if you said no. We wanted you to feel the fear that comes from knowing your entire civilization exists only because we allow it to exist. One by one, the council species fell, some through economic pressure and some through military intimidation, and some through both at the same time. And within 3 months, the mighty coalition that had declared war on humanity with such arrogance had been reduced to a handful of holdouts huddled together for protection. High Arbiter Vexalan watched his life's work crumble into dust and knew that he had made the greatest mistake in the history of his species. A mistake that would be remembered for thousands of years, as an example of what happens when you underestimate the wrong enemy. In desperation, he sent a message to Earth requesting peace negotiations, hoping that perhaps the humans would show mercy, hoping that perhaps something could be salvaged from this disaster. The response he received was 3 words: "New phone who dis." Vexalan stared at this message for a long time, trying to understand what it meant, eventually concluding that it must be some kind of human idiom indicating that they were not interested in talking, and he was correct. The humans were not interested in peace negotiations, because, from their perspective, there was nothing to negotiate. They had already won. The war was already over, and the fact that a few council species had not yet admitted defeat was merely a minor detail that would be resolved in time. The final confrontation came when the UNS Consequence positioned itself above the Council's capital world, its weapons armed and ready, its commander broadcasting a simple ultimatum: dissolve the Galactic Council and sign the terms of surrender or face the consequences. The council chamber that had once echoed with the voices of 4,000 species debating the fate of the galaxy was now nearly empty, most delegates having fled or surrendered or simply stopped showing up, and the few who remained looked at each other with hollow eyes and asked the question that none of them wanted to answer. What do we do now? High Arbiter Vexalan rose from his seat and walked slowly to the central podium, his steps heavy with the weight of defeat, and he looked up at the viewscreen showing the massive human warship hanging over their world like a sword waiting to fall. "We surrender," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough. The war was over. Humanity had won, and they had done it while barely paying attention. The war ended not with a grand ceremony or a historic treaty, but with a simple document uploaded to a public database, because humanity never bothered to formally acknowledge that there had been a war worth having ceremonies about. The Galactic Council, which had ruled 3 galaxies for 50,000 years, dissolved quietly in the night like snow melting in the spring, and most humans did not even notice because they were busy with their own lives and had frankly never cared very much about alien politics in the first place. High Arbiter Vexalan was removed from his position and sent into exile on a small moon at the edge of nowhere, and as his transport ship carried him away from everything he had ever known, he stared out the window and wondered how he could have been so blind. He had thought the humans were primitive. He had thought they were weak. He had thought they were just another young species that needed to be taught their place in the galactic order, and he had been wrong about everything. The truth about humanity had finally become clear to the entire galaxy, a truth that should have been obvious from the beginning if anyone had bothered to look. Humans were not a young species stumbling toward the stars. Humans were survivors. Their homeworld Earth was what scientists called a death world, a planet so hostile and dangerous that most forms of life would never have evolved intelligence there at all. A world where the weather could kill you, and the animals could kill you, and even the plants could kill you if you were not careful. And the humans had not merely survived on this nightmare world, they had thrived. They had spread across every continent and adapted to every climate, from frozen wastelands to burning deserts to dense jungles filled with predators. And they had done it all without advanced technology or special abilities or anything except their own stubborn refusal to die. Their history was a chronicle of horrors that would have broken any other species, wars that killed millions, plagues that wiped out entire civilizations, natural disasters that should have driven them to extinction dozens of times over. And through it all they had endured and rebuilt and come back stronger than before. And now the galaxy understood what it meant to provoke such a species. In the aftermath of the war, a new order emerged from the ashes of the old, something called the Terran Accords, a loose framework that allowed alien species to trade with humanity and travel through their space as long as they followed a simple rule: do not cause problems. Most species signed the accords immediately, eager to put the war behind them and hopeful that they could rebuild their economies with human help. And humanity proved to be surprisingly generous in victory, offering loans and trade deals and technological assistance to anyone who asked nicely. But there were some who refused to sign, proud species, who could not accept that they had been defeated by creatures they still considered inferior. And these holdouts gathered together in a coalition of their own and vowed to resist human domination. They did not resist for very long. Human diplomats visited each of the holdout worlds, not with fleets or armies, but with small delegations carrying briefcases full of documents, and what they showed the holdout leaders made most of them sign the accords within hours. The documents contained information about something called the Precursor War, an event that had occurred long before any current galactic civilization had existed, a war between humanity's ancient ancestors and a species called the Precursors who had ruled the galaxy at that time. The Precursors were more advanced than you can imagine, the human diplomat explained to the holdout leaders. They had technology that makes your most sophisticated weapons look like stone tools. They had fleets that numbered in the billions. They had conquered thousands of galaxies and believed themselves to be the supreme power in the universe. "What happened to them?" asked one of the holdout leaders, though his voice trembled because he suspected he already knew the answer. "They made the mistake of threatening Earth," the diplomat replied with a cold smile. "And now if you look at that region of space you will find nothing, not ruins, not debris, not even dust. just empty void where an empire that had existed for millions of years used to be. The holdout leaders looked at each other with pale faces and shaking hands, because the diplomat was not making threats or trying to intimidate them. She was simply stating facts in the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. "We did not conquer them," she continued. "We did not enslave them or absorb them into our civilization. We simply erased them from existence so thoroughly that most species today do not even know they ever existed. And we did this so long ago that the memory has faded from our own records." "Why are you telling us this?" asked another holdout leader. "Because we want you to understand what you are dealing with," the diplomat replied. "The Galactic Council thought they could declare war on humanity and teach us our place, and look what happened to them. Now imagine what would happen to you if you became an actual threat instead of merely an annoyance." The remaining holdouts signed the Terran Accords before the end of the day. Years later, High Arbiter Vexalan wrote his memoirs from his exile on that lonely moon, documenting everything he had learned about humanity and the mistakes the Council had made, hoping that future generations might learn from his failures. The book became a bestseller across the galaxy, required reading for any diplomat or military officer who might someday have to deal with humans, and its final chapter contained the lesson that Vexalan believed was most important. "Do not mistake human kindness for weakness," he wrote. "They are generous and friendly and often genuinely want to help other species. But beneath that friendly exterior is something old and dangerous, something forged in the fires of a death world and hardened by millions of years of survival. They do not conquer because they do not need to. They do not threaten because threats are unnecessary when everyone already knows what they are capable of. And they treat other species with patience and tolerance because they can afford to. But push them too hard, threaten what they love, force them to take action, and you will discover why every species that has ever truly threatened humanity no longer exists to tell the tale. We thought we were declaring war on a minor species. We thought we were teaching a lesson to primitive creatures who did not know their place, but we were wrong about everything. We were simply reminding an apex predator that it was hungry." Back on Earth, Vexalan's memoir was published in the humor section of bookstores, sitting on shelves between joke collections and funny essays, and most humans who read it chuckled at the aliens' dramatic warnings, and then went back to their normal lives. Because to humanity, the galactic war had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a brief interruption in their daily routines, something to mention in passing before moving on to more important things like sports and weather and what to have for dinner. And that, more than anything else, was what terrified the rest of the galaxy. Not the weapons or the ships or the soldiers, but the simple fact that humanity had faced the combined might of 4,000 species and had responded with a shrug. The Galactic Council had launched a war, and humanity had hardly cared. And that was exactly how they liked it.